Greetings, friends of liberty. I simply wanted to note that not only do the Americans finally have a new nation, we in our magnanimity having in the end allowed them that, and in which God grant we wish them well, but not only do they have a new currency, the dollar, established last year by their Congress, but they also have minted new words. One of these is the word immigrant, bandied about by no less than George Washington himself. The word, quite logically, is held to be a migrant who is coming into your own country, and opposed, I would presume, to the older word emigrant who is absconding. Now, we here in England, at least in modern times, have welcomed all manner of religious immigrants, with the one exception, of course, being that most vexatious of tribes, the Papists. In this case, our welcome a tad more begrudging. The most notable instance of immigration in English history was that of the tens of thousands of French Protestants, called Huguenots, persecuted in France, and especially by le roi de Grenouille, the Frog King Louis XIV. He enjoyed employing dragonnades, which were the quartering of troops in their own houses against them. Such royal insolence! However, it must be said that the Huguenots, for their own part, did, to a degree, invite such harsh treatment, since by their repeated rebellions they attempted to make France Protestant, God knows why, instead of taking what they could get of the religious tolerance extended under previous French kings. And after the expected violent backlash by French Catholics and the authorities, they took refuge by the hundreds of thousands in other countries, such as England, Ireland, the Netherlands, and Germany. We here welcome them with open arms, one reason being that, being more educated, of course, than your average French Catholic, they brought all manner of industry and knowledge, being employed in weaving, the silk industry, and glassmaking. Now if we turn to the issue of immigration in your own 21st century in Europe and England, we see that the remarkable journalist Douglas Murray, who appears everywhere today on social media, has written on precisely this topic of the mass migration of Muslim immigrants and others written into the continent in England. In The Strange Death of Europe, Immigration, Identity, Islam, Murray mainly describes but also analyzes the nature and depth of the changes occurring to European societies as a result of the many millions of non-European immigrants entering the Eurozone. Murray does not begin with characteristic British understatement. When I say that Europe is in the process of killing itself, I do not mean, for example, that the burden of European Commission regulation has become overbearing. I mean that the civilization we know as Europe is in the process of committing suicide, and that neither Britain nor any other Western European country can avoid that fate. What process has caused such an unforeseen calamity? Europe got hooked on migration and could not stop the flow. The result was that what had been Europe, the home of the European peoples, gradually became a home for the entire world. At the same time, Europeans were in complete denial about whether migration would work, whether integration was happening with migrant children, or even whether integration mattered at all. Murray, incidentally, points out that the tradition of tolerance of the British public and the citizenry of many European countries. In this regard, he notes how little electoral success the British fascist Oswald Mosley had when he tried to run for Parliament in the general election of 1959, and his share of the vote did not even begin to make it into double digits. But this tolerance of the public is not extended by their elites to the critics of Islam. In England, Ray Honeyford, headmaster of a Bradford school, upon pointing out how Muslim girls are often prevented by their parents from engaging in sports and whisked away to Pakistan, was forced into early retirement. This elite refusal to allow criticism of Muslims' civilizational inadequacies is widespread. Murray argues there is much worse in England and elsewhere than Muslims' parents simply curtailing their girls' education. A. Widespread instances of rape gangs and sexual trafficking. B. A welfare state widely used and abused by Muslims. C. Housing shortages caused by the influx. D. Similarly, shortages of schooling, which is not a product of any increase in the birth rate among people already in the UK. E. The fact that of British Muslims surveyed in 2009, 0% thought that homosexuality was morally acceptable, and 52% thought it should be made illegal, resulting in London becoming twice as homophobic as the rest of the country. F. How anti-Semitism throughout France is skyrocketing, with 50% of all hate crimes being visited on Jews, even though they only make up 1% of the population, and how the same is occurring in Sweden and now England. And G. How, in Germany, even though everyone shakes in fright that the far-right AfD is gaining in popularity, it was a Muslim imam in Berlin who urged God to destroy the Zionist Jews, kill every last one of them. After giving us a general depiction of present difficulties, he then turns to describing in historical detail the European migrant crisis of the last dozen years. How? A. In October of 2013, a boatload of African refugees sank off the Italian coast near Lampedusa with a loss of 300 lives, and how that tragedy resulted in the Italian Navy subsequently conducting constant patrols for migrant vessels, enabling and incentivizing by their presence and rescue missions even more immigration from Africa. B. How many liberal NGOs subsidize and facilitate the migrant flow. C. How the surge of migrants into Germany, one of the most open European countries, in 2013-14, and how Chancellor Angela Merkel in 2015, taking pity on the tale of woe told her by a young Palestinian girl, incentivized migrants throughout Africa to come in ever larger numbers, opening the floodgates. 400,000 migrants traipsed through neighboring countries like Hungary on the way to the German border, with only 20 stopping in Hungary since it didn't give out welfare benefits. D. How Greece became overrun too, with people arriving in Mytilene, a town of 30,000, at the rate of 8,000 a day. E. How in 2015, on New Year's Eve in the city of Cologne, as the city was celebrating, crowds of up to 2,000 Muslim men, flash mobs organized by cell phone, sexually assaulted and robbed 1,200 women in the main square outside the central railway station and cathedral. Soon it transpired that similar assaults had occurred in other German cities. F. How by 2016, European leaders, realizing the enormity of the flow, started changing their attitudes and shutting down border access. G. How despite German writer Thilo Sarrazin's book, Germany is Abolishing Itself, and German political scientist Bassem Tibi's warnings about the failure of migrants to integrate in their high crime rates, most German politicians and intellectuals nonetheless largely denied the harms caused by incoming Muslim migrants. H. How ironically in Saint Denis, France, where the tomb of Charles Martel, who defeated Muslim armies in 732 AD to halt their invasion of Europe, is located, now has suburb upon suburb of disaffected Muslims. As Murray says, to wander the district of Saint Denis today is to see a district more resembling North Africa than France. I. How in Sweden, perhaps the second most attractive destination after Germany, for migrants looking for the freebies of a modern welfare state, in 2015 alone had to absorb 35,000 child arrivals at the cost of tens of thousands of euros per child per year.
J. How the case of Salman Rushdie, his publication of the Satanic Verses in 1988, and his subsequent death sentence by the Ayatollah was an early premonition of the dangers Islamic fundamentalism posed and of the assassin's veto. Assassin's veto. Typically illustrative was when former singer and songwriter Cat Stevens, now converted to Islam and known as Yusuf Islam, was asked whether he would give Rushdie shelter. He replied, I'd try to phone the Ayatollah Khomeini and tell him exactly where the man is. Then Prince Charles chimed in privately with the thought that Rushdie deserved everything he got. On the other hand, feminist Susan Sontag, unlike the now king, read those very verses out loud in public, showing more courage or wisdom than the future king. K. Apart from Rushdie, others who sounded the tocsin included Pim Fortuyn, the Dutch politician, murdered by Green fanatic to protect Muslims in 2002, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, the outspoken Dutch politician who eventually fled to America, Theo van Gogh, the filmmaker slaughtered by an Islamist in broad daylight on the streets of Amsterdam, the Italian interviewer and polemicist Oriana Fallaci, Bruce Bauer, whose book While Europe Slept I reviewed here and who, like every other early warning siren, was considerably defamed for his trouble, the cartoonist at Danish newspaper Jylland-Posten, who needed to go into hiding as a result of their Mo cartoons, and the slaughter at the offices of the satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo. L. Many Muslims advise their co-religionists not to integrate, an example among many being Turkish President Erdogan, who said, whilst in Germany, I understand very well that you are against assimilation. One cannot expect you to assimilate. Assimilation is a crime against humanity. M. Finally, Murray notes that the backlash, which started in Europe and elsewhere in 2016 and even earlier, was illustrated by the French banning of headscarves in schools and burkinis on beaches, the Swiss banning the building of minarets, the rise of the Alternative for Deutschland Party, AfD, the increasingly negative results on surveys throughout the Eurozone when people are asked if they think Islam is good for society, the brief rise and then prosecution of the English Defence League by the British government and its relentless persecution of Tommy Robinson, and the rise of the Dutch MP Geert Wilders, who split off from the Dutch Liberal Party in 2004, subsequently forming his own party. Having finished his vivid and fact-packed description of events, listing the extraordinary history of Europe's confrontation with the challenges posed by mass migration, Murray then turns to give us his understanding and thus his explanation for why this all is happening. He argues primarily it's because Europe has become less religious, saying, for centuries in Europe, one of the great, if not the greatest sources of energy came from the spirit of the continent's religion. It drove people to war and stirred them to defense. It also drove Europe to the greatest heights of human creativity. It drove Europeans to build St. Peter's in Rome, the cathedral at Chartres, the Duomo of Florence, and the Basilica of St. Mark in Venice. What caused an increased irreligiosity? He first blames it on the Han. The effects of the wave of biblical criticism that swept through German universities in the early 19th century is still being felt 2 centuries later. So he says the German scholars who first in great detail showed the Bible to be without foundation are to blame. He also points the finger at English scientists, saying that in 1859, the other part of the double whammy to the Christian faith was Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species by means of natural selection, implying additionally that the rise of communism in the 20th century was facilitated by its pretense to historical certainties. Finally, sounding like Jordan Peterson, he claims that this increasing secularization of Western civilization has resulted in a felt lack of meaning. To immerse oneself in popular culture for any length of time is to wallow in an almost unbearable shallowness, implying additionally that some converts to Islam give precisely this desire for more profound meaning in their lives as the reason for their conversion. So to turn to evaluation, how should The Strange Death of Europe be graded? Journalistically, it's utterly superb. Here, he gets an A. However, his explanation for why this is happening completely fails, garnering an F. Combining the two and noting he's a journalist and never claimed to be a social scientist, I'd give it a B+. Let's proceed now to examine why his explanation fails so badly. Number one, his timeline for correlating the increasing secularization of the West with a rise of a lack of meaning and increased societal dysfunction is utterly cherry-picked, since bad things only started happening in the Western civilization essentially at the beginning of the 20th century. Before that, it was a constant and unrelenting increase in productivity, happiness, and creativity. In America, many of the founding fathers were deists who only believed in a watchmaker god playing no present role in history. Did their lives lack meaning compared to Christians of the Middle Ages? Did Luther Burbank, the famous horticulturalist, dedicating his life to producing new varieties of flowers and vegetables? Einstein, a deist, if that? The philosopher Ayn Rand, did her life lack meaning? The life of Christopher Hitchens? Number two, if we turn then to the actual causes of why the West is experiencing problems, it's because of the enormous rise in power of the state, precisely since the beginning of the 20th century. Douglas, writing here as a conservative and not as a classical liberal, completely ignores this foundational event, even though throughout the whole book he mentions the role of the welfare state, which never existed for most of the 19th century, in motivating Muslim mass migration. And as I've described comprehensively in my two previous videos, one being, is mass immigration Britain's greatest problem? And the other, my review of Bruce Bauer's While Europe Slept. The causes of Europe's migration problems are the following. A, the rise of the welfare state, which attracts bad Muslims and other migrants, and then keeps them in their dependence on the dole, not forcing them to change their Islamist beliefs. B, the failure of European governments, police forces, and judiciaries to enforce the criminal laws against Muslims, such as against their FGM, wife-beating, forced marriages, and honor killings. C, the vastly increased funding and control of public higher education, which constantly indoctrinates the cultural elite with relativistic and Islamophilic ideas. D, the drug war, which funds trafficking. And E, state broadcasting, which throughout the West constantly takes a hard-left, multiculturalist view. All these, contrary to Douglas, fully explain the reasons why Europe and England are experiencing migration and many other problems. Happy for my part that we here in 18th century Enlightenment England have mostly private higher education, with the happy result that society isn't infected with the many harmful ideologies public education produces. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.